Now it's time to get into Power BI Desktop. Go ahead and open up Power BI Desktop. You can search for it and open it. Now you might get a few pop-ups, especially the first time you open it. Just feel free to close out of those, or it might prompt you for an account. Should be completely free to use Power BI Desktop. Well, the first thing you're going to see after clicking through any of those pop-ups that come up when you open up Power BI is a prompt to import data. And there's a few options selected here, and you can see you can click here to get data from another source. The other way you can get to a list of data sources is to click Get Data up here. And I'll just mention a few of them here. In fact, there's a few that are called out right here. Lots of different ways to import some common data sources. We are going to use the Excel workbook option. In fact, our college football games workbook is an XLSX format. It's an Excel format, so we'll use this one. Another popular option is to connect to a Power BI dataset. A Power BI dataset oftentimes is a dataset that was already created when you created another Power BI dashboard. So if this is your first dashboard, that one's not going to be relevant at this point, but maybe this dashboard you're creating, in the future you'll want to create another visualization on the same data sets, the same data model. Well, you can just simply connect to that data model, so you don't need to create that data model again and then build your new visualizations on it. Of course, another option is just to edit the current report, but if for some reason you need two dashboards, two visualizations built on the same set of data, you could do that. You could just connect to the Power BI data set you've already created. SQL Server, and there's connect to Snowflake, Azure, all kinds of SQL databases. That is my preferred method for importing data. I want to write a SQL query that gets the data in the perfect format, and then take that SQL query and embed it into Power BI, import the data, and now everything is kind of set up to use from there. I like to use SQL because I really believe it's an analytic staple that is really good for selecting data, joining tables together in a really flexible way, grouping data, aggregating data. Highly recommend learning SQL and plan on doing a training course on SQL as well, and importing your data that way. Now, you've got to have access to a SQL database in order to do that. So if you're not at a company where there's a SQL database available, maybe you are limited to you importing data via Excel or CSV or other ways. There's a lot of ways that you can import data in Power BI, but I will say my recommended way, SQL. Now, it's going to come down to personal preference too. If you come to really get comfortable with the mQuery language that we're going to see when we get into the Power Query Editor, or the DAX language that we can use in Power BI as well, you might prefer to do a lot of your data manipulation in Power BI itself, which is fine. But for those of you that are really comfortable with SQL or want to learn SQL, and you'll probably tend to want to use as much SQL as possible to get your data, all your columns created, all your data joined together in the right way, as much as possible in SQL. Now, when it comes to creating what are called measures in Power BI, think about a sum product in Excel where you need a weighted average. You don't want to simply do an average of an average. You want to take into account a weighted average. That needs to be done in Power BI, because what's going to happen is you're going to have the ability to apply filters. And as you apply those filters, the data and the averages are going to change. And you want those to be, again, calculated potentially in a weighted manner. So you're going to need to implement things like that, aggregations in Power BI. But in terms of creating columns, getting your data to the right format, thinking about what one row should represent in your data set, I do as much of that in SQL as possible. Now, our data sets today are fairly clean. We've got a data set that's one row per college football game, a data set that's one row per city date combination for weather. We don't have a lot of data. We've done a lot of that data manipulation already. I've done that in the Python code that created those files. But all that to say, I prefer in general to import data via SQL. We're going to use the CSV option today as well, because our weather data set is in the CSV format. And then I want to show you what happens when you click on more. When you click on more, you have access to all kinds of other data sources. I'll just call out a few here. SharePoint is a really good one. In fact, if you're going to import data as an Excel workbook or a CSV file, perhaps you have people that are collaborating on a file, and you always want, when you refresh eventually we're going to schedule this dashboard to refresh on Power BI Online, you always want it to reflect the latest information that maybe has been entered on that spreadsheet or that CSV file. You might think by default that you just need to import that Excel file or that CSV file. I would highly recommend taking that, putting it on SharePoint in one form or another, and then having your stakeholders interact from there as a SharePoint file. What happens is it's a lot easier to schedule a refresh against a SharePoint file. It's in Microsoft Online already. And so it just becomes really straightforward to schedule a refresh against a SharePoint file versus, it's still an Excel file, but if you import it as an Excel file, like we're going to do today, uh, you will have to install a personal gateway in order to get it to refresh. And that's just a little bit more complicated. So I highly recommend, if you are going to, import a CSV or an Excel file, to import it as a SharePoint folder. So you basically choose this option, and you'll have to find your CSV file in the pop-up that comes up, or your Excel file. And it's all in the way you import it. It's the same file. It's an Excel file, whether it's on SharePoint or whether it's not on SharePoint, whether you import it as a SharePoint folder or import it as an Excel file, whether you use this option or whether you use this Excel option. But when you import it as a SharePoint file, it makes the scheduling part online so much easier. Okay, we saw the SQL Server database, Access database. Just a few of the ones that I think are really neat. Snowflake's becoming a really popular cloud SQL platform. You can import data that way. Azure Data Lake, Salesforce objects. Now, if your company has a database, a SQL database with Salesforce objects, I would recommend that. There, at least in the past, have been some limitations with the Salesforce reports and Salesforce objects here. Plus, if you're importing it from a database, you can not just bring in the whole object, but you can easily write a SQL query against it, write a where statement to filter out certain rows, or a group by or sum statement to aggregate. So keep that in mind. If you have the Salesforce objects in a SQL database, I would just query directly from there. But those are some of the options that you have when it's importing data in Power BI. Now, just continuing to go through the different ribbons here, you have several ribbons similar to Excel. One of the options that you have in the ribbon, on the home ribbon, is entering data. And so I'll show you how to do that. This is just entering data manually, which is a pretty rare use case, but every now and then it does come in handy. I'll click on enter data here, and now I'll have the ability to just go ahead and create a table. So we'll call this fruit, and say apple, orange, pear. You can give your table a name down here, and I'll call it fruit. Load. And there we go. We'll have our first data table just entering data manually. We'll delete this ultimately, but notice in our data pane over here, we'll go over this a little bit more soon. It will have basically a table called fruit. You can expand it and see that there's one column, fruit. And just a quick table we'll create as well. We can go to the visualizations pane here, click on table, and we can just drag in our one column into that table. See that we have apple, orange, and pear. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to delete that. So in order to delete that, I'm just going to kind of click on that visual, click delete, and then I'm also going to delete this table. So in order to do that, you can hover over the table on the right side. There's these triple dots, which is used to basically get more options. In this case, we're going to say delete from model, just a test. If you like this video, I hope you'll consider liking it for me. And if you'd like to see more analytics, data science, and leadership training videos, please consider subscribing to the channel. Finally, if you have any questions on what we discussed today, please leave a comment and I'll try to respond to it as soon as possible. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.